Hello and welcome back to another DIY Friday, and today we're looking at this. This is the Topton N305 NAS motherboard. This is an MITX motherboard that's rocking out the gate with an 8-core Intel i3 processor. Now, if you are looking at this online, if you're looking at just the base level model for this MOBO combo, you may see some reasonable prices knocking around. Don't be deceived, there is an N100 version of this that's knocking around for about 200 nicker. This is about 300, probably about $280, $290 for the CPU and motherboard combo here. And if you want to get this with a few upgrades on board, we got this with 128 gig of storage on an M2 NVMe, a Gen 3x4 drive on the rear, and we also got it with 8 gig, and that added about $50 to the price tag there. But if you want to go up, you can go up to about an extra $200, which will add on a 1TB drive and 32 gig of DDR5 memory. What are we going to do in today's video? Well, we're going to take a closer look at this. We're going to see what it does, what it doesn't, dig into the PCIe on it and find out more about it, and obviously take a closer look. But hold up, let's talk a little bit there about Topton MOBOs. Let's face it, when it comes to DIY NAS solutions, whether it is you're knocking around with, getting your Jonsbo case filled up there or something a little bit more bespoke, I will say right now that at the forefront of the majority of a lot of Eastern companies that are coming out of the fold producing NAS-ready SoC or mobile CPU components on a ready-to-go motherboard, Topton and brands like CWWK are kind of leading the charge above many others. There are others, MINISFORUM and such, but mainly there at the front is the likes of Topton, really making a name for themselves. And I'm not going to throw around words like reliability, because let's face it, a lot of you, the websites that we see products like this on, there is debating points about the reliability and warranty and return policies on stuff like this. However, on this channel, one of the very first boards that we were talking about last year was this. This is the Topton N305 board there. Don't worry about the SSDs because we're using it for today's video later on. And this was a standard class Intel Celeron processor board here. There was also a Pentium version in the N6005. And to say that this board was popular in DIY NAS use is a joke. It really did balance a good price point versus power. Not just power ability, but power consumption. Now, this is the natural progression of that logic that went into that board with certain tweaks and improvements. Arriving with that mobile SoC component there underneath a combined passive and active CPU cooler there, incredibly low depth there, which means there's pretty much not an ITX NAS case in the LAN that's not going to fit into. This CPU is an Intel N305 12th generation processor, arriving with 8 cores and 8 threads with a potential clock speed of up to 3.8 gigahertz. TDP power consumption there of between 9 and 15. It is settable within the BIOS settings. We'll dig into that later on. Also, when it comes to memory, and we flip this bad boy over, we can see a single memory slot. And we'll go into a little bit more detail later, but that supports up to technically 32 gig of memory on the board, but actually 16 gig in the majority of cases, and that's up to 5600 megahertz memory, non-ECC. That CPU as well, by the way, has integrated graphics that can go up to potential clock speed of 1.25. It's a decent enough board, I've got to say. Before we get a closer look at it, one of the earliest questions a number of users have about this is this kind of the new ITX NAS DIY darling? And I'll say right now, with the exception of your powerhouse Ergings, with the exception of perhaps the one we looked at a couple of weeks ago, this is that AMD Demon board, with the exception of a few powerhouse models, for the price, this is really hard to beat. Now, as we move our second camera into the side of the screen so we can get some decent close-ups, with this board, the board on its own isn't what you get when you buy it. The CPU arrives pre-attached there with the heatsink there, so you don't have to muddle around and deal with it yourself. Also, with this board, there are several versions of this board knocking around. Not only the N100 model, which has improvements on the PCIe layout, sharing between the PCIe upgrade slot and some rear PCI connectivity that we're going to talk about later on there. But I would say the other thing about this board is this is a DC input board. What do we mean by that? Well, it means rather than utilizing a normal power supplier, if you're only going to use on-board hardware architecture, this board arrives with a DC input directly into the board. What does that mean? Well, when you buy the DC version, it arrives with a power supply that immediately runs into that board. Now, this is a Shikoni, never heard of them, PSU, and this is rated at 180 watts. There will be an article linked in the description below that goes into more detail on all of the components that this arrives with. Also alongside this, you've got your standard plain backplate. You've also got a power splitter there for a SATA drive, because there is one physical SATA input on this device. And finally, you've got a SAS fan-out cable as well. If we open that up, take a good closer look at that. We've got our SAS fan-out cable there going into, and that's an 8643 SAS fan-out as well, going into 4 individual SATA connectors there. And that is because this board arrives, as we can see on there, with not only that SATA connector, sorry I was wrong, there's 2 SATA connectors there, but on top of that, it also has that SAS input. That SAS input, which takes advantage of, and you can't really make it out here on the recording, but there is an AS media component, the JMB585, and that J8B, that 585 controller is allowing that SATA connection there of up to those 4 drives, adding up to a potential 5 to 6 SATA drives on this board. Carrying on with that subject of power and storage, however, we do have to talk about a few different exceptions to that rule. So first and foremost, when we're looking at this, we've mentioned earlier on that we've got our SATA connectivity there at the top and feeding into that mini SAS connector there, but there is not enough power coming through directly that DC interface, and that is why here at the back of the board we've got 2 further 4-pin power adapters. That is going to be for a SATA cage or introduced or connected to a SATA backplane there. So just keep in mind, just because this board arrives with that DC power in and that external bigger power supplier, that's not going to be enough to feed this into a lot of cases, and unfortunately that is not a cable that's been included here. We've got a SATA connection there and for the drives, and we've got additional power there for that one SATA, but just keep in mind that introducing this board into a pre-existing case is going to require additional cabling there. Now, moreover, on the subject of storage, we can talk about the base of this board. As mentioned earlier on, when I purchased this for an additional $50, I added both an 8GB DDR5 memory board, and I added a 128GB M2 NVMe SSD. Now, each of these slots are PCIe Gen 3 ×1. There is also an additional smaller factor Wi-Fi adapter card here on the back, and of course on the other side we even have that cut PCIe Gen 3 ×1 slot there at the base. Now, the reason I bring all that up is, as powerful as the N305 CPU may sound, that's tucked underneath that heatsink there, keep in mind, this is still an 8/9 lane CPU there. That is not a lot of resources to be spread out across this board. And the lanes that have been afforded to PCIe or PCIe level services and connections on this board are all down to ×1 speed. So when you do get your M2 NVMEs inside this board, just keep in mind they've only been afforded about 1,000 megabytes per second to play with. And some of the services like those SATAs are on that shared SATA to PCIe switch controller on site. Now, again, 1 or 2, you could perhaps use a card to introduce more M2 NVMEs there at the top, but keep in mind, look how small that adapter is. You're not going to have much to play with, and at least in the case currently with the N305 or the N300 board, it is still shared between here and that back Wi-Fi adapter. But one thing I don't hear a lot of discussion about online is right down here, you could almost miss it there at the bottom. What is that? Why, that is a 4G SIM card slot. That's right, you can actually introduce direct mobile broadband into this board. Now, it's not new, that's happened before, but it's not particularly common, and it's an interesting feature of a NAS motherboard, because now we've got a remote failover, perhaps for notifications, perhaps for something more aggressive, depending on the NAS OS you're going to be utilizing there. And that, combined with that mini PCI adapter there at the top, means, 4G Wi-Fi connectivity here. We've got a lot of network failover there, but that's not really all of it, because of course on the rear, as has become largely the associated point with most Topton boards, we've got our 4 individual 2.5 GBE network ports. 2.5 GBE ports there, and each one with its own lovely individual network controller there. Yes, we've got USB connectivity, but I will tell you right now, it is fairly lackluster, the USB connectivity on this board. You're not going to see anything that's particularly breathtaking, and a lot of the hardware architecture has kind of been dedicated to expanding the storage. Also inside, as you've already made out, particularly for you Unraid users, we've got ourselves a couple of internal USB 2.0 ports there as well. So there's a good amount of connectivity there, but the bandwidth of those individual USBs is not exactly going to knock you bandy. On top of that, we've got ourselves some 4K 60 frames per second USB, HDMI and DisplayPort connectivity there, and overall the layout of the board is a very, very clean board. I just wish that this could garner some of the useful upgrades that went into the N100 board. And if you are looking out for that particular one, by the way, look out for the green N100 board there. Indeed, when you lay them out side by side, as you can see here on screen, you've really got to see a lot of improvement there that has happened with the refinement of these two boards. There's only about two and a bit years of development between them, but the replacement of things such as the memory and the M2 NVMes onto the rear of this one with the original Topton N305 board largely wasting a lot of that physical space there on the rear of the PCB. It's really nice to have seen them really innovate and improve within this board layout. But I think that's enough of the jibber jabber and showing you this board on screen. Let's get this inside the Ugly Betty test machine and take a little bit of a deep dive into this board. Right, so heading our way into the motherboard, let's jump immediately into BIOS here. Let's take a little look about what's on offer here. And for those of you that watched my video previously on that AMD Demon board there with the Ryzen 7, I'll tell you right now, this is a breath of fresh air. We've got all manner of configuration options at our disposal here. Again, all of it to really tweak this system to quite an astonishing degree there. We're not going to dig in too deep, but it will say the amount of CPU control there. And, you know, some of the individual options to the PCIe that we can talk about are all pretty much on offer here. I'm going to cycle through them because I know there are some of you that are looking at this motherboard that want to know just exactly what level of control is afforded to you. So though we're going to highlight some of these along the way, and when we dip into an OS and go in via SSH, we're going to see more on the terminal. But for now, just wanted to sort of cycle through to show some of you what are the options that are afforded to you there. I would say, again, this is fairly, well, for the most part, standard for an Intel board, Intel CPU board, I should say. I'm certainly used to seeing a lot more options than we saw last week on the Demon. And I think the level of control afforded to us here, if we're going to be going down the road of configuring a very, you know, modest NAS here, the fact that it's got that 9 to 15 configurable TDW, I think is going to be very beneficial for a number of reasons here. And also some of the power on and auto power on, you know, a power loss scenario are all kind of rolled in here quite neatly. Again, everything's fairly standard. We're just going to cycle through. We're not going to dig in too mad deep, just to sort of see what level of control Topton have ensured is included via the CPU chipset and stuff here. We've already got a USB drive in here with Unraid. We've also got an SSD that I might be doing some TrueNAS on down the line. But I think for now, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and fire directly into Unraid so we can see a little bit more about that hardware and also take a little dip into the background to see how much of those afforded lanes are available. So let's go. And so now Unraid has finished. Let's disable that and make our way directly in. We've got Unraid booted up here on this mobile, and as you can see here, we've got our i3 N305 breakdown there on the left of the screen. On top of that, again, we're recognising that 8 gig of memory up there. They're saying up to a maximum 64 gig, which I'm kind of surprised about, but again, it does differ from config to config. I've seen this CPU used, for example, alongside some TerraMaster NAS systems, supporting up to 32 gig of DDR5 memory, but again, still no ECC memory support there overall. Overall, kind of like the layout what we're seeing here. I know a number of you are going to be wondering why I didn't go down the road of using Unraid on this. I really just wanted to get some easy access into the terminal for SSH. This isn't really a review so much as an overview. I'd say on the interface, one thing I will say, I was kind of hoping that the 4G SIM there on the rear would be supported, or at least visible, but unfortunately that is not a feature that's built into Unraid. Even taking advantage of USB adapters, which is a bit annoying, so it does make me wonder whether, in order to take advantage of that SIM 4G card slot, whether you're going to have to be looking at things like pfSense or OpenWRT, something like that. But let's head into the terminal. Let's do ourselves a favour and just take a little wee look there on a configuration of a lot of these hardware specifications inside and go through those together. Let's full screen that and start from the top. There is that SATA controller we mentioned earlier on, the 585. I have been hearing mixed reports about this controller online, and if you are a power user, you're almost certainly not going to enjoy the utilization of this SATA controller on this, but this is really focused on a more efficient system, hence why you're going to find that same controller both on the i3 version of this board alongside the N95 and N100 versions. But at least there's a breakdown there about what exactly is broken across the different IOs across there. Further along, we can find that SSD that we purchased with this board, and as we can already identify that even though it is on a Gen 3 ×4 lane there, it has been downgraded almost certainly to fit the amount of hardware architecture in here into this very limited lane setup. You know, a bit of a shame, but still nonetheless, at least we've got access to that Gen 3 ×1 lane, I'm assuming, as we go further down. Much the same, the second slot here, once again, 8 giga transfers, or Gen 3 ×4, downgraded to ×1. Indeed, as we make our way through this whole system, you can see some real creative use of the individual lanes there, but there's barely a single lane or device or hardware component peripheral that has been added into this system that isn't already restricted to ×1. Some of them are obvious, such as some of the network controllers being passed through, but all the way through this system, you can see they've really had to be rather creative about the application of the entire hardware architecture of this machine and spreading out those 8 to 9 lanes incredibly thinly. When you lay out the entirety of those PCIe lanes here on screen, you can see that there's actually a decent amount for such a modest board and CPU combo here running all the way through. And it's not going to be for everyone, as I mentioned earlier on with regards to that SATA controller. Certainly, there are users out there in a slight mid to high power user NAS category that are not going to be a fan of that. But the rest of it, I actually think they've crammed in quite a lot for quite a modest board with such a low power consumption there. Further digging into the memory, although it's already confirmed earlier on, it never hurts to find out. And of course, continuing moving forward, error correcting code or error code correction memory, ECC, is very much not on the table here. We can utilize that, you know, the 8 gig they've included there, which, let's face it, it's good that it's Samsung memory they've included, but it's fairly basic DDR5. But for those that are considering a real server, again, this is not going to be for you that are really into your ECC and error correcting code, your true NAS hyperscale type servers. This is not going to be the motherboard for you. This has very much got a small, even entry-level prosumer build user in mind. Now, as mentioned, there's the original SSD that this system arrived with for that extra $50 and the extra SSD that I've added to it. So let's take a little quick of a performance read there on there. We're going to do a 1 gig performance test just to get some numbers. Again, bear in mind this is an NVMe on Gen 3 ×1, so that's 1,000 megabytes per second to play with there. I'm just going to do that repeated test manually. We're making sure not to use any internal caching, and that performance number is fairly consistent at around 770 megabytes per second for a 1 gigabyte transfer there. And again, that is creating that data all the way through, but how about if we try to transfer the data between the two NVMEs? Let's see what the share ratio is on this individual M2 NVMe and also between the two individual drives together, transferring data back and forth. Now here we are moving data between the two disks. We're certainly going to see a different performance number there, and immediately, can you see there, the performance has dipped quite astronomically down to 320 megabytes per second, data being created between the two. So even though this system is clearly utilizing NVMe Gen 3 ×1 on each of those, there's definitely a throttling point between the data being transmitted between them there. Now, whether that throttling point is to do with a shared PCIe controller between the two of them, or just simply the fact that this data has been transferred between the two on a shared lane, it's still not ideal to see numbers there transferring data from one M.2 NVMe to the other M.2 NVMe, both of which are apparently being afforded, you know, up to a potential 1,000 megabytes per second bandwidth, and still only barely hitting slightly more than an enterprise-grade SAS hard drive. So that's a bit of a kick in the nadgers there. But again, the odds of someone utilising these M2 NVMEs to just send data between them it's going to be a little thinner. You might be using it in this scenario if you were running a RAID across both of these disks, but still nonetheless, that is definitely less than I was hoping to see. I thought I would see maybe 500 to 600, some kind of confliction or static interference between the two of them, but nowhere near as low as this. Finally, I wanted to dip into HD Palm just to repeat some of those tests from earlier. Unfortunately, you could ignore that lovely big number that might be filling you with hope at the top there. We have to bear in mind those are cached numbers, and realistically, HD Palm was still spitting out somewhere between 755 and 760 to 70 megabytes per second there. So pretty much everything we saw before, and only doubling down on, 3/4 saturating the majority of that Gen 3 times 1 slot there. But that's really it in terms of the hardware layout there, at least on a PCIe perspective. If you guys would like to see some NAS testing on this device, at least some performance testing, we're going to get in some drives inside the Ugly Betty and get that going through each of the motherboards that we've been talking about the last couple of months, and of course comparing them. So we're working on a video right now between comparing the original Topton N305 board versus that of this N305, and of course the AMD Demon board, because these all represent very different user case scenarios and price point. But let's head back into the studio and summarize today's video. But there you go, that was the N305 Topton board. As mentioned just now, we are going to be working on some comparison pieces utilising the same RAID array on the original Topton board there. We're going to be looking at that Ying Intel Core processor one there. We're going to be looking, of course, at the AMD Demon board and comparing them all against the N305, because right now we've got to look at performance, we've got to look about power consumption, and we've got to look about general noise. You know what, I'm just going to do something there, because right there, I want you to know just how quiet this board is. I just wanted to end this video on that. I'm going to bring my mic a little closer. I've disconnected the fans on the Ugly Betty there, and I just wanted you to hear it, just for a bit. Because it's a minor point, but that CPU fan there is actually surprisingly quiet, and that is on full power, full spin, that fan right now. Now compare that with what you think the likes of this board are going to sound like with its powerful heatsink there because of its Intel Core architecture there, 13th Gen i9, and of course that heatsink, which although it's a smaller form factor Jonsbo that we've got on the AMD board, I can tell you right now, and for those of you that watch my other recordings, you'll know that those Mobos and those fans were noisier. Once you put those into a larger case, perhaps a metal Jonsbo one, you never know. And I think that is something we may have to consider as well when it comes to the noise of these boards. Obviously, we're going to have to factor in the noise of the drives and the overall chassis, of course, but that's one of the things I think often gets overlooked about these smaller NAS boards here, that the smaller ITX architecture, unless it's treated right, can actually be quite noisy, and these smaller SoCs, and particularly an i3 8-core, arriving in the same hardware architecture as the likes of a Celeron quad-core, is a really impressive feat to be able to maintain heat dissipation and that lower TDW as well. But overall, I'd say right now, I like this board. My final judgment, I'm going to hold off until we do the full performance comparisons all together, but right now, for the price point, it may seem a little bit steep and maybe not as fulfilling for power users as some of the other options here. I would say right now there is a good reason why the N305 board is very popular to those looking for a simple NAS system that's going to be on 24/7 and are worried about the lecky bills there. But full performance later on with the likes of Plex and of course transfer speeds as well. Stay tuned for those, and do keep your eye open for DIY Fridays here on the channel. Thank you so much for watching. If you need further assistance, use our free advice section on NAS Compares. Head over to Ko-Fi and Patreon for expedited support options, our membership tiers and Zoom consultations. Take advantage of Are Topton NAS Compares if you need support, or the Discord as well for community support forums, and of course use the NAS builder over on NAS Compares to build the right NAS solution for you. But apart from that, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.